got to be a friend of the family or be affiliated to the family to be able to get this much access. But then I read the notes, and it was just a case of something that sparked your interest. You were just sort of drawn to the story. So I wanted you to elaborate on that, why it was so important for you to sort of to do this.
Well, I was lucky enough to be invited to meet Lucy and Ron, Jordan's parents. Funnily enough, a couple of weeks before the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin verdict, which was about 2 years ago now. And we spent a week together in Jacksonville and Atlanta, where his parents lived separately. And we just hung out and we, learned more about who Jordan was and what happened, and kind of just started to think about what these 3.5 minutes, the time that the two cars were next to each other in the gas station, what they came to represent. And at that time, I was looking at this idea that in that tiny amount of time, you could look at racial profiling, access to guns, and these laws that give you the kind of confidence to use those guns. And that was how we began, if you like, the journey. And then we managed to get access to film in the courtroom. And then as time unfolded and as we were in the edit, Ferguson happened, and then obviously many other cases since Ferguson. And that's when the film, we didn't change anything about it, but it started speaking back to us differently, or more widely, in the sense that suddenly those 3.5 minutes came to represent so much more than we'd originally envisaged, and in particular that the kind of DNA of what happened in those moments, and why Michael Dunn had this perception that 4 young black guys could be out to kill him. That 3.5 minutes became a metaphor for all of these other cases that subsequently happened.
Now, what I love about this documentary is that inside access look. And I've never been inside a courtroom unless for a traffic ticket. But so, what have you learned from that access? Because I learned that not a lot of attorneys going rejections, like on the TV shows, every 5 minutes or so.
There weren't any, right?
Exactly. What did
there
you
were. We just didn't.
Oh, okay.
No, joke. I think I learned something very shocking. I found it very shocking. 2 things that happened during the trial that I also wouldn't have ever understood unless I'd been sitting through filming the whole trial. And those 2 things were, one was that race was never allowed to be discussed in the courtroom because Michael Dunn wasn't apparently racist in the moment of the shooting, because no witnesses heard him say anything that was racist. Therefore, the defence lawyer in pre-trial hearings had convinced the judge that it wouldn't be fair if we talked about race during the trial. I thought that was an incredible revelation, because there became this crazy juxtaposition where we were inside the court filming, race not being allowed to be discussed, and then you'd go outside and everybody, whether physically in front of the courthouse or on the airwaves of Jacksonville and beyond, knew that the whole thing was about race. And I think that revealed something very institutional, or an element of kind of institutional racism. And then I thought the other interesting thing for me about being in the courtroom and having access to the courtroom was, ironically, you have the seal of Florida is there above the judge's head, which says "In God We Trust," as if this is a hallowed place of justice happening. And really, I just felt like watching the defence lawyer and the prosecuting lawyer. I almost felt like it was a bit like being an editor. Like, whoever can edit the best story of what happened during this 3.5 minutes is going to win. And I thought the defence lawyer, much as I, ultimately disagreed with what he was actually defending, he did an incredibly successful job at sowing enough reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. And I felt like he knew that was like the Achilles heel of the justice system, that all he had to do was sow reasonable doubt and his client wouldn't be found guilty. So, sitting through that in a very visceral way over a few weeks, and obviously we try and translate that to an audience who only have an hour and a half to watch it. But yeah, I think they were the things about getting access to the courtroom that were really important, to go beyond just the news.
We talk about the family, which is always important because now we're seeing more of the family story stuff where years ago we never heard of anything like this before. And how hard was it to get your cameras then? Because were they not allowed in there in general?
In the courtroom, or
Right.
in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we ultimately it was the judge's decision whether we could put cameras in there or not. So we spent maybe 4 or 5 months, I think we started before the trial to try and make sure that we were able to do that. If we weren't able to get access, they would have just had 2 CCTV type cameras that would have just fed out to regular like pool media. And we basically convinced them that if you're feeding out to pool media, let me be there. I'll film it much better than a CCTV camera. The media will get great footage on a day-by-day basis, but we'll be able to keep a hard drive full of everything that was recorded. And respect to the judge that he let that happen. I mean, I had to be extremely careful that I never accidentally filmed any jury members because the feed was going out live, and that could have led to a mistrial for the privacy of the jury. But other than that, there were no, and that was obviously a very fair stipulation. But other than that, they were hugely accommodating, the judge and the team in the courthouse, and we're obviously hugely grateful that they let us do that, because it would have been a very different film without that.
Talk about the family aspect of that, because I thought the father was really interesting.
Yeah, and actually the parents have a lot to say, obviously, about being in inverted commas, like on the victim side, because so in court, just one other thing about family in court, the family, Jordan wasn't allowed to be referred to as a victim during the trial, which obviously is hugely offensive to the family. And again, I understand that in like legal terms, because to call him a victim would have potentially altered the kind of neutrality of the jury. Hearing him being referred to as a victim would have implied that Michael Dunn was guilty somehow. But for the family to have to go through that is hugely almost offensive. And also, I think the judge does mention this in the film, that he asks people not to show too much emotion as family members sitting through the trial, because they're right next to the jury. And those types of things, for a family to have to live through that on a day-by-day basis, I can't imagine what that must have been like. And also the fact that they then, in morning and evening, go home and watch the news and then see this story. Yeah, it was like for them being caught in this kind of eternal kind of feedback loop, where they're in court, they come home, they watch the trial on TV, it's analysed by loads of media pundits, they go to bed, they wake up, they go back to court. Like, those few weeks were, you can only, so intense for the family.
Has the family seen the film?
Yeah.
Their feelings, and how do you feel about that?
We showed them the film just before we finished making it, just to check there was nothing factual that we got wrong about the family. Obviously, that was a hugely, extremely emotive screening. So for them to see, the last year and a half of their lives reflected back at them in such a compressed amount of time. And then when we premiered the film at Sundance, they came to all of the screenings, and then when we were doing Q&As after the film, they would come up on stage and be part of the Q&As. And they would receive some of the awards at some of those festivals that we've received, relating to like the social impact the film can have. And now I still sit through the film with them at some screenings, and they must have seen the film now 20 or 30 times, and it's really difficult at the end of each screening. There's always some time that's needed between the end of the film and then when we go up on stage and do the Q&As, and the impact it has on audiences when Lucy and Ron walk up onto the stage. I would say 90% of screenings, they get a standing ovation, and people have such a huge amount of empathy for what they've been through.
When you got permission to shoot in there, did you have to compete with any other news people?
At the beginning, no, we didn't, because we began the process so early on. So because we met with Jordan's parents about 7 months before the trial began. That's when we started speaking to the courthouse, and at that point no one else was asking the courthouse. So by the time other people wanted to do it, we'd already been
So
through
you
several
made it
months.
sure that it was exclusively you.
Yeah, yeah, and it was really important to me that it was me physically filming, because I knew that there are, there's, as I think come off in the film, there's nuances in people's facial expressions and that give away so much, particularly the judge and some of the officials in like the courthouse environment that aren't allowed to overtly give their opinion on what's happening necessarily, but you can see from their body language like their sense of frustration and disgust at some moments during the trial. And if that was a regular kind of news camera person or CCTV cameras, we never would have captured any of that.
Now, was this a hard pitch to the studio to get it funded?
Documentary is always it's always a hard pitch, but we were fortunate that some foundations came on board very early on who gave us enough money to shoot the trial. So we were under pressure that obviously we couldn't miss the filming of the trial. So we got enough money. There was an individual who had a film fund who was very keen on the film, who helped out at the beginning. And actually was one of the exec producers on the film, and yeah, some of these like the Ford Foundation and MacArthur Foundation who are there to they understand the potential power of storytelling, and how that can inspire change on certain issues.
Mark, what do you hope the audience gets out of seeing this movie?
I think there's I think there are different things different audiences are going to get, right? I think for gun owners, I think there's an interesting message in there that maybe you want to take a little bit of time before you use your gun, otherwise you might end up in prison like Michael Dunn for the rest of your life. And I think for some white audiences, I think the film sometimes loudly and sometimes quietly kind of invites them to reflect on their own conscious or subconscious kind of racial biases, and I think in a bigger way, particularly through the character of Michael Dunn, I think the fact that he was so naive as to his own racism, I watch the film sometimes and I think that Michael Dunn is almost a metaphor for a part of America that is also naive and blind to its own racism, and I think that's something. That's probably like the ultimate thing that I think the film is about.
Now, Mark, you've obviously straddled the fence, being a break, and now obviously, touched the fence over here in terms of racial profiling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you remember the Stephen Lawrence case back in the UK.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just curious, how do you think racism differs between here, the UK, and also the US? Could you weigh in on that?
I don't know actually. I've actually been thinking about trying to get in touch with Doreen Lawrence to actually see if she'd like to see the film, and potentially when we launch the film in the UK, maybe she can meet with Jordan's parents. But I think obviously there's huge differences, but I think maybe like the similarities are important, and that is that all these injustices and racism and inequality, all these things are so intricately linked, and yeah, it's very prevalent in this case in the US at this moment in time, but this stuff's been going on since the days of colonialism and beyond. Like all these things are so deeply entrenched in the way that certain countries have gained power in the world.
But is it different in your eyes? Because you are from the UK, you've seen it.
I mean, I think it's different in the sense that the UK wasn't, of course, was built on slavery, but that slavery occurred, abroad more than it did actually at home. In the US, slavery occurred actually in the US. But I think the same mentality of who thinks they deserve to have power and what they're going to do to keep that power, I think that's like almost unfortunately and quite universal.
What happened?
Sorry.
One of the things that I love that you did with this film is you kind of treated the audience like the jury itself, and you left that up to us to really decide how we felt. Why did you choose to go that route? Because it could have been a very different film had you not done that. And also, did you kind of hit any roadblocks being a white filmmaker taking on a film that is so racially driven?
To answer your second question first, no. I didn't feel like there were any roadblocks at all, and I think that for me as an individual, I don't find it difficult to to talk about these types of issues, and I think, as I said, I think they're hugely universal and they manifest themselves in very different ways, and in this particular case it manifested in that 3.5 minutes, but there are many other films I've made that are essentially about the same thing, which is power structures. And your first got jury. So sitting through the trial was when I came up with that kind of concept or idea that for as long as possible it might be really interesting to try and put the audience in the minds of the jury, so that the information that the audience received was the information the jury were receiving, and that's why I think it helps. That's why I think you get invited almost to question your own biases, because you have to sit there and listen to the evidence and make your own decisions about whether and why and how a man like Michael Dunn could actually come up with, actually sees the world in a way that there was a gun when there was no gun.
What happened to his wife after that? Because her testimony was mainly the thing that the nail in the coffin for him.
Yeah, so they broke up. And I mean, in many ways I don't feel sorry for her, because she didn't call the police afterwards, and she was more interested in their dog and wanted to get home and all these types of things in that first 24 hours. But another part of me feels sorry for her. She was in the gas station when the whole thing happened. She thought she was attracted to this type of man, and subsequently now her whole life's been destroyed. So, and as you can see in the film, she's a fragile. I love that moment where the judge, raise your right hand, and she raises her left hand. Totally, I mean, I think, there were times where, I felt really sorry for her that she had, by this just crazy moment in time where two cars, of all the cars that could have pulled up next to each other, this event occurred, and she was dragged into that situation. But she's now, I think,
Did you
single.
get any feedback from him? Because I know he's probably played that scene 1,000 times over in his head.
Yeah, I think he's played that scene 1,000 times in his head, and I think he still thinks he did the right thing. I really do.
Wow.
I really. There was never a point where I've ever felt, in both trials and anything that I've heard on phone calls, that at any point gives any impression that he is regretful. I mean, I'm sure he's regretful that he's in prison, but I think he would say that he was hard done by, and the whole, in all his phone calls, and even the way he talks on the stand, I think he was just convinced that he did the right thing.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Can we do a picture with you with the poster, please?
Yes.
Well, I'm just glad she had the conviction to tell the truth.
I know. Can you imagine if she'd had?
Yeah.
From the front.
I enjoy the conversation that this has started, this film.